little presentation. Our scholar this week who is here is Dr. Gayle Morse, who is Mohawk and here from Sage College in New York. And she was here a few years ago as our speaker for our conference in the fall, and said that she'd like to come back and visit and be our scholar for a week, even if it was in January. So here she is. So I'll turn it over to Gayle and let her talk about research and ethics in Indian country.
So thank you for having me. Thank you, Dr. Gray. I'm not really formal, so please ask questions if you want. When we meet in Haudenosaunee territory, which is the 6 tribes, we always start our meetings by asking people to put our minds together as one so we can do the work we need to do. So I'd ask you to let's put our minds together as one so we can focus on what we're going to work on. And we also would say, Skenetgoga, Nyawa, Agwego, which means I hope I find you at peace. Thank you for having me, all my relations, which is kind of, we use Agwego, all my relations, similar to you might hear the Lakota or Dakota use that in ceremony, because all my relations is part of how we think about being interconnected with everybody, and why it's, this is why ethics and research is kind of a passion for me, because often in the scientific community, it's not necessarily about everything being together, but looking at separate variables and things like that. So, in recent years, there's been quite an increase in mental health research and other research in Native communities. How many of you are familiar or have done research in Native communities? A few folks. Good, good, good. So there has been an increase. And at the same time, there's an increase in efforts to develop more robust methods of research that respect the integrity of the community, which is a little different than how many of us were trained in conducting research. This has been misinterpreted the data. Some have used the data for other means than what they said they were going to use it. Some people have not returned the data to the communities. One of the biggest concerns I hear from where I do research is that researchers come in from universities, because we're all really smart and know all about research, right? And we go into a community and we don't understand how the community functions. We know best because we're the researchers, right? So part of the challenge of conducting research in communities for us is that we have these really important scientific methods that we've learned that guide how we put research together. But some of the methodological and procedures that we've learned don't necessarily match. So I want to give you a tiny brief history of how research has been conducted in ethnocultural communities using inappropriate designs and methodology and interpretation. I want to talk about how research can both be scientific and healing for a community when it's conducted with integrity, transparency, in a manner that is recognized by the community as ethical, as in having integrity. So community voices around the world now are demanding ethical research and challenging the way ethics has been conducted. Ethnocultural communities are no longer really interested in research being conducted on them. So that's usually, well, I'm going to go do a study in, you know, the reservation, and I'm going to do it on these people and figure out X. They're not interested in that. They don't want any researchers there doing that. So the increase in research conducted among ethnocultural groups around the world has been mounting community concerns and negative reactions to Western research methodology, which is pretty serious because we're researchers, right? They're concerned that the researcher be more accountable to the community, which is not something that has often had to be a concern in the past. The expectations for the community for respect, trust, and equity and ethical research as designed or expected by the community is presenting unplanned challenges because we haven't been trained in that kind of research. Not trained in methodology that encourage relatedness between the researcher and the community, that encourage interdependence between the research and the community, and transparency about the research questions. So what the community defines as ethical may not coincide with the time and productivity demands of the research we do in Western research. So if you're on a tenure track at a university, for example, and you're a new faculty and you've got to get a bunch of research done, you've got to get publications so you can get tenure, doing a community-based research project that takes 5 or 6 years is not going to be helpful for you. So it's very difficult for a new researcher to develop a program of research that they can do in time to get tenure. I mean, that's a conflict, trying to fit what we have to do with what we'd like to do. Doesn't always work. So another challenge is the co-development of research goals and research methodology with communities. Because typically in the past, we're the researchers, we're the experts in our field. I'm trying not to sneeze, getting a tickle in this room. So we're the experts. We're used to coming up with our research question, right? We come up with a question, we develop a methodology to figure out the answer, and then we get to publish and get tenure. This is all wonderful. What's different is that the communities now are expecting, especially in Indian country, that people come in and work with the community to develop the research question. The other issue that comes up is the question of who owns the data. So my question is, who owns the data? Do you as the researcher own the data? Does NIH own the data because they give you the money? Does the university own the data? Does the community own the data? These are really important questions to consider. And in the past, researchers would always say, this is my data. It's my intellectual property. When the communities are saying, no, this is our data. I know of one instance where a researcher did a project at a Native community, and he did a cultural identity scale. And when the community saw it, they went back to the researcher and insisted he give them all that data back because they had not really approved the measure. So that caused a whole different set of problems. So that can be controversial in our universities and where we do research, is that the communities now consider they own the data, and they are more interested in where the data goes and having input into the interpretation of the data. The communities now expect to be involved in the process of research as well as the fruits of the research, as well as being part of the publication, as well as being part of the interpretation. Many scientific groups, psychology, anthropology, even medical research, has a history of cultural ignorance and bias when conducting research. Researchers from these disciplines have failed to follow principles of informed consent, failed to report their findings back to the communities, and failed to share their data with the communities. In 2006, a woman named Harriet Washington wrote a groundbreaking history book about medical apartheid, which provided evidence of almost 400 years of medical experimentations from colonial times to present, which had serious ethical flaws. For Native communities, we have many that you've probably read of, you've probably heard of. We've got some of the difficult projects or highly publicized projects, including the Barrow, Alaska study. Have you ever heard of that one? Or the Havasupai project, or the Human Genome Diversity Project. The Barrow, Alaska study was done by a state researcher and an independent researcher. And they were trying to examine alcohol abuse in a community with the idea that they would develop some form of treatment. And when they published their data, they had quite a negative outcry from the community. And the reason the community was concerned was that they failed to use a culturally appropriate measure of alcohol consumption. It had never been tested with any Alaskan community ever, had been only used in the lower 48. And they had singled out the community for substance abuse and published the data as if this community had the worst substance abuse in the planet, right? Not realizing that other communities throughout Alaska had basically the same baseline rate of substance abuse. So they singled out a community, they stereotyped a Native community, and basically defeated any chance of ever doing research with that community again. And the scientific merit of their study was called to question. So then the researchers had problems. So it became a terrible mess. Now, if you recall, the Havasupai problem in the 1990s was all over the paper. It was in the New York Times, it was everywhere. And they talked about the researchers collected blood samples from the members of that tribe because they're very isolated, so it's a good place to do research, right? A nice homogeneous sample and all the good things that we know about research methodology. And what they were trying to attempt to find a genetic link to diabetes, because that is a huge public health problem in the United States. But they failed to find any genetic link, so they had to reformulate their study because it's very expensive to do genetic research, and they came up with other studies looking at schizophrenia, inbreeding, and trying to uncover factors that could explain human migration patterns. The tribal members were not aware of this. It was nowhere in their informed consent that they would be doing other things with their study. And in fact, the tribal members hadn't heard anything of it until they were invited to a presentation at the one of the universities and heard about all this research that was now being done with their blood. They, of course, sued to get the blood back and from the university, and also to stop research with that. So those are just two examples. The human genome, and those are local and in smaller places. The human genome study, though, is a worldwide study. They sometimes refer to it as a vampire study because they're taking blood from people all over the world. This study has been condemned by indigenous people all over the world, and the United Nations Bioethics Committee has said this is not appropriate. The project is still being funded. The project is still underway because the scientists have argued that they're not singling out anybody, that they are going to document the blood of every group of person, every group that they can find. Further, they suggest that the indigenous population who oppose their work just don't understand. Just don't get the important scientific work they're doing, which of course, you know, echoes the colonial views that we've heard from time to time, that everybody knows better than the indigenous people. And I talked with a very wonderful young man this morning who said, you know, Native people are smart. Nobody just notices it. And that really got my attention because I was thinking about this and how other researchers come into indigenous communities around the world and act as the experts when they're not necessarily the experts. So in response to these problems of a variety of disciplines, it's not just psychology, it's not just medicine, it's not just anthropology, it's almost all disciplines. One of the projects I was on had chemists, biologists, engineers, and everybody was still making the same mistakes. So in response to these kind of ethical dilemmas, violations, many organizations are coming up with guidelines, and the Society of Indian Psychologists, for example, examined the American Psychological Association Ethics Code and found pervasive and consistent ethical violations in the ethics code, which I thought was absolutely fascinating. The native psychologists who were involved in that project found problems with every part of the research and publication standards of the American Psychological Association Code. So I think that was telling that they really have made an impact. Now, at this point, other ethnic minority groups in the United States, particularly psychologists, are developing their own ethics codes because of the difficulties with APA. One of the problems that they found that was pervasive in a lot of the research, and even in the codes, was that in Western society, researcher is the expert, without remembering that community is the expert in their area. And so there needs to be a reciprocal relationship where the community has an expertise and the researcher has an expertise, and they join together as partners to develop the project. So the process of the research needs to be part of that partnership. Researchers should not assume that the community is too naive to understand the research. Rather, it's incumbent upon an ethical researcher to clearly explain their methodology in language that community members understand. So using jargon isn't useful. Using words that most people could understand is more important. So it requires the researcher to use communication methods that are not common in academia. And now I'm a psychologist, for example. The jargon we have in psychologists is incomprehensible. Sometimes I read stuff that I've read in graduate school and go, I didn't understand it then. You know, the language, the jargon is difficult. So there's different ways to do research. One project that I examined is a good example of community participation. So even before they submitted the project for review, the researchers went into the community and evaluated all their measures with the communities. They did focus groups, they asked grandmothers, they asked grandfathers, they asked, do you understand this question? What does it mean to you? Is it offensive? They went through every measure and every question and evaluated it to determine the potential reliability. Would people respond to it in the same way? The validity, does it mean something to them? And the acceptability. So for example, in one questionnaire, there were questions about sex. And in this community, the women said, nobody's going to answer those questions. It's not appropriate. So forget that. Another one, they said, one of the questions was, do you attend, and this is on a rural reservation, do you attend cultural events such as the ballet or the opera? So that's not really, culturally relevant in any rural town, right? So they changed it. So upstate New York, you might say, do you attend cultural events such as hockey? That would be a cultural event in upstate New York, right? Here, same thing, right? It's kind of cold and icy most of the time, so I'm going to assume that. So going to the community to look at your measures becomes the first step. So before they wrote their project, before they accepted it, they went to the community first. So one researcher argued, well, it's not really the methods. The methods are sound. We're good scientists. We know the methods. But it's the participants' naivete that is responsible. They don't understand. We know what we're doing. So because we tend to go in as experts, we think we know it, but we don't understand. We need to recognize our own cultural naivete when we go into a community and understand that we don't know. And we don't know what we don't know either, is the biggest problem. So with the intersection of research methodology and cultural context is the piece that we have to be really careful to recognize. So one native psychologist noted that there's a strong mainstream Western, this is a quote, so I'm gonna read it directly. There's a strong mainstream Western ideology of what research is, that there's virtually no room to put any indigenous context into the publications arising from research with native populations. And that was one of the arguments of the community. There's no context for understanding why we have this problem or why we're collecting data on this issue, why is it serious? And that when the publications are written, more communities are expecting community members to be part of the publications. So anything we do with our research, I do research on the Opportunity Reservation, every single publication includes a community member so that we can be careful to include that cultural context, because that can change the meaning dramatically from a stereotype into something that is useful and can be translatable to other cultures, perhaps. Another researcher said, respecting the dignity and sovereignty of the community dictates that a community member be included in writing and any publication, but more importantly, interpreting the research outcome. So time and time again, people who are involved are consistently saying, include the members in your writing, which is not something we're taught to do as researchers in academia. It's important because that allows both emic and etic, or internal and external perspectives, to be utilized in interpreting the data. And it allows the cultural context to become an important part of the narrative. And it frames the outcomes in a way that's more useful. So, in response to some of the complaints, many tribal groups have developed their own guidelines to doing research in the communities and their own ethical guidelines as well. The Mohawks of Akwesasne, the Navajo, I've probably got a list of 10 groups now that have their own guidelines for doing community research. And now it's becoming almost a standard worldwide that if you're going into a community that you're not part of, that you're going to follow these guidelines and get even IRB approval from the community, not just from your institution anymore. Some of them, not all of them. The American Anthropological Association, American Psychological Association have all developed guidelines for doing ethnocultural research now. The International Union of Psychological Science has issued guidelines for health research involving Aboriginal people. It's becoming more acknowledged that there's more than a single way of defining ethics, and that using community views needs to be an important part of the ethics. Now, in psychology, the American Psychological Association encourages psychologists to be aware and consider their own biases and values. And of course, I think many disciplines now are expecting you to kind of watch your bias when you're developing your research. It's important because in skillful research, skillful ethical research recognizes and respects culture and ethical frames. And our biases can influence how we see that. In fact, the research says that explicit bias is infrequent and has exhibited itself less as the years have gone by, as we've become more aware of racism. However, implicit bias is pervasive. 75% of all Americans display an implicit preference for white people when they're shown pictures of white compared to any ethnocultural group. Whether it's, oh, would this person do a better job, if that's a question, or this person looks like a friendly person, it could be innocuous. Sure, this person looks nice. 75% of people in the United States would pick the white person first. So the implicit bias, the bias we don't recognize in ourselves, becomes important. There's a large body of research now, both individual and meta-studies, that report automatic white preference across cultures. So all of us are responsible for that, even people with egalitarian views. So there is a change, there needs to be a change in our culture of research that recognizes we can't know everything about even our own biases. So culturally competent research needs to be contextual, relational, and honest. And honest research recognizes inherent biases that we have, recognizes that there's culture, and is consistent with the groups is consistent with the groups that are part of the study. Culturally competent research, though, is only a piece of what we need to do effective and ethical research. We have to add the principles of cultural relevance and cultural humility. Those are two pieces that are frequently continue to be missed in the research that we do. Cultural relevance refers to, if you haven't heard that term before, it comes from education, and it talks about services or research designed to be constructive for a particular community. The researcher who coined it was Gloria Ladson-Billings, who talked about empowering students by maintaining cultural integrity. In that way, they could succeed academically. So if any of you are from a different culture and you attended college the first year or so, it might have been difficult because the expectations were different than what you expected. So often, having a mentor who understood your culture, who could help you navigate your way in, was helpful. We need to kind of use that in research too, to help a community navigate science in the way that we've been trained to, so that they can understand the nuance, yet we can answer the questions they need answered. A good researcher should consider the culture in order to be related to the community, and maybe have to develop a new approach or design a new method to be relevant. But being able to adapt to what is there is what will help them, will help you do the best research. But to remember that it's the community, not the research, who is the final determiner of cultural relevance. Researchers may not understand the importance of cultural relevance if they haven't explored the notions of multicultural competence or cultural humility. That's not really a term that we think of as researchers, especially in academia, because cultural humility isn't one of our best skills, I don't think. But multicultural competence is only a first step. It's mandatory for a researcher to actively seek out skills to become multicultural and competent. But cultural humility is the piece that's been missing, in my view, for a long time. It's the next logical step from cultural competence, which now we have cultural competence training everywhere, right? So we assume we are getting that, but cultural humility is different. It's the step that has us doing a personal reflection, a self-critique, where we, one, acknowledge our power in the positions that we have as researchers, and acknowledge the need for the community to help us do our work. So we acknowledge, yes, we have power, we have a position, we have knowledge, but we also acknowledge we need help to do our work. We need help from the community that has the knowledge of their community. The mutual benefit that develops between communities and individual researchers can be done in a non-paternalistic way where all parties understand the process, the assessment, the treatment, and are all dedicated to the research outcomes. When you do research in this way, you don't have people dropping out of your research. When I did my first study on a reservation, I had 100% of people who requested to participate. We did a random sampling, and every single person participated. Why do you think? Any ideas why you think everybody participated?
Did they see the research as valuable to their community?
Number one, they saw the research as valuable. That's not the most important thing. That's one of the important things.
I'm imagining you were inclusive when you were designing the research with them and they bought into it?
That's part of it, but before that, you're right.
They had the idea.
They had the idea, right? It was their idea. It was important to them, and they were part of the designing. Everybody showed up, and in subsequent studies after that were, outflow from those, everybody shows up. So not only is it important to have cultural humility, it's important to recognize that they're going to help you. You will get your research done, and you'll get it done timely, you'll get it done effectively if they're part of your effort. I think that's really important. If you've worked in indigenous communities before, often you'll find you go into a community, they don't know you, they might not talk to you, they might listen to you and nod and walk away, right? Because they want to see your character, they want to see who you are. And so if you understand the notion of cultural humility, you're not going to go in and assume you know everything, and therefore more likely to be accepted. So it's not the objective, compartmentalized research that constitutes the gold standard that we've been trained to do. But one way to do it would be community-based participatory research, CBPR. It's not the only way, but it's one model that is easy to understand that can help you do the kind of research you need to do in communities. In CBPR, research is where the researcher and the community become partners from the inception and the design, the implementation, and the publication. All the things that need to happen, all the things that communities have been concerned about. So even your dissemination plan includes the community. The methodology of CBPR is not just how to do research, but rather a way of approaching research as a partnership where all members are equal partners. And that's part of it, understanding the notion of equal partnership. It describes a respectful way of conducting research with Indigenous people. And the guidelines have similar themes of respect, equity, empowerment. In the book, The Basic Call to Consciousness, which was originally an address to the United Nations in Geneva by Oren Lyons, who is a Seneca, he described the Great Law of Peace of the Haudenosaunee. The Great Law was originally designed to prevent the abuse of humans, and that's why it's important to think about when we talk about ethical research, because there's so many ethical abuses. The Great Law stipulated that all people are free and have the right to protection under what the peacemaker called the Tree of Peace. The basic principles of peace went further than the simple absence of conflict. It related to the Ganyangahege, which is Mohawk. That's Mohawk. The Mohawk words Skena, peace, Galawio, good mind, and Ganasitale, strength. When you put those words together, they have a different meaning than just that singular word. The Great Law outlined an ordered society capable of protecting people from abuse and dedicated to the containment of hierarchy, which is very different than how we function in academia. Peace seems like an unconventional word to use when speaking of research methods. But in terms of CBPR, for example, it is fairly parsimonious. In its address, Oren Lyons stated, quote again, I'm going to read directly, the active striving of humans for the purpose of establishing universal justice, the ability to enact the principles of peace through education, public opinion, and political, and when necessary, military unity. It is the product of a spiritually conscious society using its abilities to reason. So it's not taking spirituality into this metaphysical plane, but it's using science and reason too. So when we work for peace, or SCADA, we work towards developing our good mind, Galileo, and it is then when we can get our work done. It's then when humility can be the driving force and thoughts of superiority and prejudice and privilege no longer drive our research. So rather, humility comes first when you're using the concepts of a good mind and peace and strength. Indeed, it takes a strong person to be humble. When I started talking, I talked about Oguego, which is all my relations. And in the Lakota, and Dakota, they use a similar phrase. That term in both groups, and indeed throughout much of the Americas indigenous communities, is spoken during ceremonies to greet relatives. But it's deeper than that. It's to thank life and to thank everyone for all they do. It's a very complex construct shared by indigenous groups. The concept now is behind many indigenous psychologists' view that we can't isolate variables, that it's more important to consider have a more holistic view. While CBPR is discussed as one methodology, there are many others, but the key is to understand the person within their context. This is consistent with Bloom's discussion. A recent article in last year written by Art Bloom from Western University of
He's from
Washington State University in East Cherokee. He wrote that psychological science needs to consider indigenous views which can improve upon the current standards of research. Holistic perspectives supported by communal goals and a spiritual worldview may represent the best and most complete way to address community problems. So I think these aren't the only ways to think about ethical research, but I think it is a way that's a little different than what we've been accustomed to, and not meant to be, a lecture, not a you, but really offered as something to think about. How we fit within both the context of where we work, but where we want to do our research, and how we, even how we are able to be participants in research, or able to use the research that comes our way, to view it from using these perspectives. But not meant to be the only answer. It's the answer that we're developing now is something different, but it's not the only answer. So I would welcome anybody's questions or thoughts or additions to these kinds of ideas. I think they're ideas that I hope make us think about things that help us move our own research forward. Any thoughts, concerns, questions?
One of the tribes in North Dakota, the Turtle Management Board, have done an excellent job of developing a research structure and having just that, a structure and infrastructure there. There's been collaboration and really kind of developing that with some people from UND and also people from NDSU. So assuming that's totally unique, what other tribes around the country really are, instead of waiting for research to come to us and having to deal with that outsider coming in, or actually generating their own processes, which may involve them reaching out to universities and collaborating with them on an equal basis as opposed to a dependency model.
Right. Well, that's what CBPR kind of, is a good example of. It helps train people. So in a lot of our research, if we've got, we try to build in training for community members. They're the one. We don't send people in to do the data collection. We train them to do the data collection. In one of ours, we also did a mini research methods class where they got university credit. So those were the kinds of things that made people say, we're going to them. We have a problem, we're gonna go to that place and ask them because we know they're gonna take care of us. So I think it kind of, you have to give to get, but that's one way. That community goes to that university for everything now because they offer credit at the college for these trainings. They've been trained in data collection, they've been trained in data entry, they've been trained at this point in neuropsych testing. Some have been trained in blood draw, so they became licensed phlebotomists to do the studies. So that's the kind of interaction that it's about developing the relationship so they know you and they'll go to you. So you're now, I mean, here, the amazing work that's being done here, I'm not surprised that, they're coming to talk to people at UND.
The other thing is, in North Dakota, I think all of the tribes are in some level of developing their own research review process. They're at various stages of that. And the National Congress of American Indians has developed a training for bringing together researchers and tribal members in addressing the cultural humility and all of that between the people that are wanting to do research together to help them move forward with those relationships. So there's some really good things happening.
And when these kinds of things are developed and the relationships built, they're there. And they're not going to be broken easily. They were hard to build, so.
I mean, that makes sense though. Yeah. When you're actively involved in developing something that benefits your community, your collection of communities, as opposed to reactively going, yeah, that's a good idea, that will help us. But if you're involved at the beginning, there is that idea, what Chelsea's getting out of that ownership, which is essential, because then it's ours. It's not yours coming to us, it's ours. I like that.
It works.
Are these all students? Are we all students or faculty, or? I'm just kind of curious of who's here, because I think it's such an important presentation and message, and I see one of my faculty members, and I wish I had more of my faculty members here, because I think it's a significant challenge, exactly what you said, and one of the things that the university is doing is creating a committee that's composed of some internal UND faculty members, but mostly external members from our various tribal communities and the tribal colleges to help faculty figure out what is true collaboration and what are different ways, how do you build relationships and how do you begin to learn the strengths and the needs, et cetera, of different communities. And we're just now gaining speed to learn that, and so I'm really glad to see so many people here, and I'm just kind of curious. Are these faculty, or are these all students, or is it a mix?
It's a mix.
That's fantastic. That's great.
Yes.
I would say that I'm also staff, but I am in program evaluation, a form of applied research, quite often the grants. There's a big effort to be culturally competent there, and the American Evaluation Association could be added to the list of associations that you mentioned that have made statements.
Oh, really?
Yes, since 2011, and community-based participatory research and evaluation has been, can be found in the literature as well.
One of the hurdles for grant writing though is limited space. And, you know, embedding the project within the cultural context becomes really a careful dance of trying to fit it in this little, you've got this much space to write, but it needs to be there. So, because sometimes the grant readers aren't as culturally competent. So that's important too.
Is this being taped today? Will it be
Yes.
available?
So,
Yep, it'll be on our
That's
website.
great, because I think the IRB board, this would be a nice thing for us to review and to give every board member an opportunity to.
it will be on our website
Mhm.
Great, thank you so
at
much.
some point. I can't tell you exactly the date, but
End of the week, beginning of next week.
next
Okay,
week.
great.
You-
Wonderful, thank you. This is a great opportunity.
You know who's here, so we will notify people that this is available.
No, I don't know who
Just
else.
give it a sign.
We need a sign and sign
Can we
sheet.
go around, I mean,
Yeah,
We've got some time.
can we quickly go around and sort of say a little bit about ourselves and who's here? That would be terrific. So I could know who I'm talking to.
I'm Linda Newberg, and I work for American Indian Student Services. And I sponsor a lot of grants over the years, worked with tribal communities.
I'm Teresa Huff. I'm a doctoral student in counseling psychology.
Brad Gibbons, Deputy Director of the Center for Rural Health at the School of Medicine.
Mark Crunchakins, a master's in counseling. Jonathan Thompson, second year's master's in counseling.
Serena David, PhD student in counseling.
And I'm a master's counselor.
We'll get those guys.
I'm a Chicago master's student in counseling.
I'm Mallory, and also counseling.
Kathy Smart from Education and Chair of IRB at UND. Michelle Bowles, I am the IRB coordinator.
I'm Gary Hardman, Director of the Center for Rural Health. I came here from the University of Arizona, which is not the university that had the problem with the Grand Canyon.
That's right, a
Arizona
different.
State University, but it doesn't go away. One of my folks, Allison Hughes, when you know who she is, was trying to get more providers down for that tribe. And at some point, 10 years after that, somebody there mentions, it's we're the Office of Rural Health too. Somebody mentioned that she was from the University of Arizona, and all the tribal members stood up, turned around, and walked out. And why the woman the woman who did it was responsible. Never lost anything. She violated human subjects left and right, and still has her damn job at Arizona State University, which is. Maybe there's pictures of somebody somewhere that got her through it, but I don't, something was wrong in a way. I would expect if I did something 100 that bad, then I'd run and getting fired. And that didn't happen.
That's what you think.
That's what you think. I'm sorry.
We need to hear that.
I'm EP Xie. I'm the faculty from Department of Social Work.
I'm Kristen Charleston. I'm a communication specialist at the Center for Rural Health.
I'm Darby Brannick. I'm a nursing student here at UND.
I'm Jessica Hager. I'm also a nursing student here.
I'm Lexi Wesson. I'm a nursing student.
I'm Melanie Sage. I'm an assistant professor in social work, and I work with the Supreme Court to audit our Indian child welfare compliance in the state.
Good.
I'm Mandy D. Peterson. I'm a research analyst at the Center for Rural Health, and I'm also a doctoral student in the Educational Foundations and Research Program.
So I am Rebecca Quinn, and I'm a program director at the Center for Rural Health.
I'm Ahmed, and I'm a research specialist at the Center for Rural Health.
I'm Jamie Witt. I'm a project specialist at the Center for Rural Health.
Stacy Kuzler, Center for Rural Health.
Irene Churchill. Counseling master's student.
Chelsea Luger, project coordinator at Seven Generation Center.
And who's over there sitting down?
I'm Brianna Johnson. I'm one of the doctoral interns at the University Counseling Center.
Oh, nice. Nice, I'll see you later this week.
Yeah, I'm Susie Highfield. I'm also a doctoral intern in clinical psychology over at UCC.
I'm Ben Uwaki, postbac fellow at Seventh Generation Center of Excellence.
My name is Nathan Reese. I teach art history and work with the University Art Collections.
My name is Alexis Sanabria. I'm a first-year master's student for counseling.
I'm Sean Cleary. I'm the editor of the Dakota Student, the student newspaper.
Phyllis Wheeler in the counseling psychology program.
Hi, I'm Mark Detch. I'm a counseling psychology doctoral student.
Nikki Mossman, communication coordinator at the Center for Rural Health.
Cole Pate, Center for Rural Health.
Gwendolyn Hume, faculty in criminal justice.
Courtney Subanosov, American Indian Student Service.
Eric Skavanosok, I'm a PhD student in the Department of Educational Foundation and Research, and I'm also a system evaluator for the Center for Rural Health. I have a question that sort of, I was thinking, I really resonate with this notion of CVPR and reciprocity, but I struggle as a young academic with the idea of being able to involve the community and to disseminate information that is not only of use, of relevance, and in a timely fashion when inadvertently the structure of academia doesn't allow so. It's always latent. It's always a 5-year study. It's these types of things. So how do the two spheres even commingle?
Well, there's ways. You're right, it's not easy. One of the things I did was start a small journal with short articles, summaries of data that have to be written in a way that's easy to read. Then I send those to the Native communities so they can put it on their website or their newspapers or whatever, so that it helps get that information out. And it's amazing how much they read it. And it's a free online journal that they could go to anyway, but that's one way. But there are ways to do it. And I think it's important that the data gets disseminated. They participated because they want answers. So it has to go back.
And it's been difficult, like getting the data back to the community in the past, because there wasn't really a place for it to go. And now that communities are developing their research infrastructure, they're developing places for that data and trying to reclaim a lot of the data that's been collected in previous studies.
But it's hard. It's not, easy, but. Right.
Hi, I'm Evelyn and I'm counseling student.
I'm Bob Pulaski, Director of the Bureau of Educational Services and Applied Research. And we're basically an evaluation unit. Excuse me. But as you mentioned, that need to get data back quickly. For instance, HRSA is calling for rapid cycle quality improvement. And it's really difficult when you have 1-year grants for traineeships. I mean, how do you do that quickly? But one of the things that you're starting to see now is visibility of data and visible dashboards online, and all part of that big data piece. That's something that we need to explore, especially when we're looking to improve programs as they're being implemented.
Yeah, and collaboration. I mean, we've got people from everywhere here. We come up with like an amazing study. Nursing and counseling and clinical and art and information and program and health. Yeah. So, I mean, you've got everything here. Right in this room. Thank you.